Today is a journey as we are celebrating Black History Month, as we use one of the books that was written by one of our great African American writers, Howard Thurman, who was known to speak to the truth of oppression through writing his book, Jesus and the Disinherited. The book is actually giving us a model of what Jesus called us to be about, because when we look at the life of Jesus, biblically, according to the Bible, Jesus was constantly interacting with the disinherited. Jesus was involved with those who were poor, oppressed, downtrodden, and also those who had been what we call the marginalized, those who had been pushed aside. And so in this great book, and I'm going to get to the biblical text in a moment, Howard Thurman is giving us a clear sense of identity of who Jesus was and what his mission was while he was here on earth. Howard Thurman believed in the radicality of Jesus. He believed that Jesus was radical for his context. And so I've used the title of the sermon this morning called Strange Fruit from the Cross. And as I was trying my best to figure out how to present this sermon, for some reason these words would not leave me, because the cross represented the strange fruit, in the words of Billie Holiday, the words that described the context in which Jesus was born. Jesus was born into a world by Mary and Joseph, and he came into a world that was politicized, a world that was dominated by the Roman Empire and the Greeks. And also he was born into a world that was heavily divided among the Jewish groups. So Jesus was not looking for trouble. He was born into a world where he was doomed to be in trouble. Jesus was born at in the part of the history where the Roman Empire was the oppressor. They were the ones who had control of Israel. So the birth of Jesus was a revolutionary threat to the Roman Empire. We know that when Jesus was born, the emperor had declared the reign of the Pax Roma, and the Roman Empire had become so threatened by Jesus as the Messiah that Herod ordered all male children to be killed, to be destroyed. So Jesus was born into that radical time, and if we are going to link with the sermon theme, it was a strange setting for Jesus in which he was born. The suffering of Jesus was so intense, so violent, that people could not believe what was happening as he hung on the tree, with humiliation and with shame. So the cross becomes a symbol of the disinherited. The cross becomes a symbol of the strange fruit in which Jesus was born. The strange fruit was symbolic of the cross. The strange fruit was symbolic of the cross. It's interesting that the cross has become a symbol of strange fruit. The symbols, as we look in history, as we look in the context of American history, as we look at the time in which Black Americans were born, we see the same strangeness in terms of the context of American history. The cross became the symbol of suffering and shame. The cross became the symbol of those who were castrated because they were fighting for freedom and for justice, fighting to stand for that which is right, fighting for the cause to vote, fighting for civil rights in the United States of America. We cannot follow Christ without suffering, humiliation, criticism. There can be no cross with no crown. We cannot escape the perils of suffering, no matter how hard we try. So the cross became an ugly symbol during the time of Jesus. No one could understand why Jesus was suffering on the cross. No one could understand why the Roman Empire would seek to destroy a good man who had lived a righteous life, and yet he hung with innocence on the cross. So the problem with the cross is that when we look at the cross, we have to look at the cross in terms of its cost. The cost that Jesus paid for those who were disinherited, those who were the marginalized, those who were the outcasts, those who were castrated, those who were pushed aside. We see that Jesus wanted, as he hung on the cross, to identify with the suffering and the shame. James Cone, who is one of our Black theologians, once said that there is a correlation between suffering and also how we live our lives. So the cross can be seen as a form of devastation and almost a form of lynching, almost a form of destroying a man who was innocent. Billie Holiday says in her song, Strange Fruit, she says, the bullying eyes and the twisted mouth, the scent of magnolia sweet and fresh, and then the sudden smell of burning flesh, here is the fruit of the crown to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, and for the wind to rot, and for the trees to drop. Here is the strange and the bitter crop. Jesus died on the cross with shame, humility, but the cross was the symbol of the strange fruit. For the Christian faith, the cross is a symbol of the disinherited. For the Christian, the cross is the symbol for those who have been devastated. The cross is a form of the costly grace of discipleship in which Jesus gave to the world. So in Acts chapter 10, verse 39, it says, they put, namely Jesus, to death by hanging him on the cross. The Roman Empire instituted the first form of humiliating death by hanging Jesus on a cross. It was excruciating. It was nail biting. There were nails that were pierced in his hands and in his feet. But on that cross, Jesus was able to stand against the powers of the oppressors. He was able to stand against the oppressors, the broken, the marginalized, the downtrodden. He was able to stand on the cross because he realized that he was called to die. The cross was about persecution. The cross was about suffering. The cross was about going to a place to die. Peter, here in this text, is the main disciple who is being persecuted. In chapter 10, Peter is in Caesarea, which is 32 miles from Joppa. The city had been known for the Gentile Christians who were non-Jewish, and they were being persecuted and discriminated against. And Jesus was making a statement that the gospel was not only for the Jew, but the gospel was for the Gentiles also. So Peter began to preach a sermon about the power of Jesus and his mission on earth. According to Dietrich Bonhoeffer, we must be clear about the differences between costly grace and cheap grace. Cheap grace discipleship desires the benefits without the cost of following Jesus. And so if we're going to look at Howard Thurman's book, Disinherited, we have to realize that there is a cost which comes from following Jesus. Following Jesus may even cost you your life. It may cost you your life in the terms of following Christ, because those who follow Christ are following the one in whom we honor. The burdens of following Jesus on the cross makes us feel like a motherless child. Oh, sometimes we feel like a motherless child, a long ways from home. Nobody knows the trouble that we have seen. Nobody knows the sorrow. Nobody knows. Peter was preaching that suffering was intense when we die on a cross. Crucifixion was a Roman form of public service announcement to the world. Do not engage in sedition as this person has done, because if you engage in sedition, you too will die on the cross. Strange fruit from the cross. Strange fruit comes from the cross for those who suffer and those who die. Strange fruit comes because Peter was preaching to us about suffering. Strange fruit comes when we hang on that cross before the entire world. Strange fruit comes when we do as Martin Luther King Jr., who stood up for freedom and justice. Strange fruit comes when we stand up for freedom and justice in a world in which there is no where there is no justice. Strange fruit comes if we are willing to die for which we believe. Strange fruit comes when we stand up for truth. Strange fruit comes when we stand up like our ancestors did in our history here in this country. Strange fruit comes as Howard Thurman reminds us of the perils of the disinherited. Strange fruit comes from those symbols of pain and suffering. Strange fruit comes out of our suffering. Strange fruit comes when we follow Jesus. Strange fruit comes when we take up the cross and follow him all the way. Strange fruit comes when we preach the gospel and allow ourselves to be humiliated and mocked and humiliated by those in whom we love. Strange fruit comes when we stand up for social justice. Strange fruit comes when we allow the Son of God to embrace God's Spirit into our lives. Strange fruit comes when we realize that justice is costly. Strange fruit comes for the marginalized, the poor, the outcasts, the homeless, the downtrodden. Strange fruit comes when the church allows itself to become the salt of the earth. Strange fruit comes when the church begins to allow itself to change the world. Strange fruit comes when the church rises up with a vision. Strange fruit comes when we see the cross elevated, lifted up, high as we follow the cross. Strange fruit comes when we allow ourselves to put on the crown of thorns on our head and follow Jesus. Strange fruit comes from the cross. The cross is the symbol of strange fruit. The cross is the symbol of the disinherited. As we honor the one in whom we follow, his name is Jesus. We shall have some music now from Strange Fruit.